Millionaire leaves his struggling wife for a stranger, then this happens. Julia Bennett had always believed in the kind of love that could survive anything: poverty, long nights, broken promises, and uncertain futures. She and Matthew met in college, both hungry for more in life, both fueled by dreams that felt bigger than their means. They were inseparable from the start. He, the charming visionary with a million ideas and $0, and she, the grounded, nurturing partner who believed in every one of his wild ambitions. When Matthew failed, Julia reminded him to try again. When they were evicted from their first apartment, she laughed with him as they moved into a cramped studio above a noisy pizza shop. One day, he used to say, kissing her forehead, "We'll look back on this and smile." Years passed, and Julia held on to those words like scripture. She worked double shifts at a rundown diner, pouring coffee for tips while Matthew hustled, pitching his startups, meeting investors, making cold calls from their one-bedroom kitchen table. She sacrificed vacations, clothes, and even her own dreams of becoming a writer, all to support his. But she never complained. She believed in him. She believed that love, real love, was about building together, even if she was the one doing most of the heavy lifting. And then it happened. One of Matthew's ventures finally hit gold, a fintech company that exploded overnight. Investors poured in, money rained down, and suddenly, the man who once scraped together coins to buy her a birthday, Cupcake, was driving a sleek black Tesla and taking meetings in glass-walled offices downtown. Their world changed. The apartment turned into a penthouse. The bills were no longer a worry. But along with the success came something else: distance, silence, coldness. Julia started noticing the shift in small ways: the missed dinners, the late-night work calls that never ended, the perfume that lingered on his jacket when he came home. She told herself it was just stress, that success brought pressure. She tried harder, cooked more, dressed better, stayed patient. But the warmth that once radiated between them was gone, replaced by polite nods and half-hearted love-yous. She was living with a stranger who wore her husband's face. Then came the night that shattered everything. A Thursday, cold and gray. Julia had made his favorite, spaghetti carbonara, candlelit the table, even played their old jazz playlist. But when Matthew walked in, he didn't sit. He didn't smile. He didn't even take off his coat. "I met someone," he said flatly, avoiding her eyes. "Different. It's serious. I think I need something just like that." 15 years of loyalty, sacrifice, and love were brushed aside with 5 words. Julia stood frozen. The warmth of the room suddenly sucked away. "You're leaving me?" she whispered. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. The silence screamed louder than any answer. Have you ever watched the person you gave your whole heart to walk away without looking back? Julia didn't cry that night, not immediately. The numbness settled in first, a cold, invisible fog that clouded her every thought. She stood in the doorway of the penthouse, her suitcase, half-packed, barely realizing she was putting clothes into it with no plan of where to go. The place, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like a museum of broken promises. Every framed photo on the wall mocked her with memories of a man who no longer existed. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Horns honked. Streetlights blinked. People hurried by with umbrellas and purpose, oblivious to the woman who stood on the edge of everything she had ever known. Julia hailed a cab with trembling fingers, her wedding ring still on her hand, its weight suddenly unbearable. She didn't have a plan. All she had was her name, a duffel bag, and a broken heart. With nowhere else to go, she returned to her roots, a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, to the modest 2-bedroom house her parents left behind. It had stood empty for years, dust on the windowsills, peeling wallpaper, and creaky floorboards that echoed with childhood laughter long gone. But it was hers. It didn't matter that it smelled of old books and mothballs. It was the only place left where she could remember who she was before. Matthew. The first night, Julia curled up on the couch with a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender. It was the same one she'd wrapped herself in after her high school heartbreak. Funny how life came full circle, but this heartbreak felt deeper, more permanent, as if a part of her had been amputated and she was left learning how to live without it. The days blurred into one another. Julia floated through them like a ghost. Her phone stayed silent. The friends she had once shared dinners with were now part of Matthew's glittering social orbit. They whispered, they speculated, but they never reached out. Pity was a quiet thing, always watching, never touching. Bills piled up. The last of her shared bank account dwindled. She sold her engagement ring at a pawn shop for half of what it was worth, but she held her head high even when the clerk looked at her with quiet judgment. Julia took a job at the local library, modest pay, but peaceful. She shelved books, wiped down counters, and listened to the comforting rustle of pages being turned. She wore cardigans and flats and became invisible again, this time by choice. It was in that stillness that something began to stir. One rainy afternoon, as she dusted the self-help section, a book slipped off the shelf and landed at her feet. Resilience, the Road. Back. She stared at it for a moment, then cracked it open. It wasn't just a title. It was a whisper, a message meant just for her. Have you ever felt like the universe was trying to tell you something, even when your world was silent? The book stayed with her. Resilience. The road back became Julia's quiet companion. She read it in the stillness of early mornings, before the sun rose and the world could bruise her. She underlined passages scribbled in the margins and dog-eared pages that spoke to the part of her that still believed she could be more than just someone who was left behind. Each chapter peeled away another layer of pain, revealing something unexpected underneath. Strength. One chilly morning, with a mug of tea cradled in her hands and a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, Julia sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop for the first time in months. The screen glowed back at her like an invitation. She clicked open a blank document. At first, she just stared. The blinking cursor mocked her silence. But then her fingers moved, slowly, hesitantly, and then faster. The words poured out, her pain, her betrayal, her rediscovery. She wrote about the moment Matthew told her he was leaving, about the ache that settled in her bones like winter, about how she couldn't breathe when she walked past his cologne in a store. She wrote about the silence, the library, the way the city kept going like she never mattered. It wasn't neat or polished. It wasn't pretty. But it was real. Julia wrote every day after that. Morning pages turned into essays. Essays turned into letters. She never sent. And one day she clicked submit on a piece titled When He Left, I Found Myself, sending it to an online blog she had followed for years. She didn't expect anything. But a week later, an email popped up in her inbox. We loved your story. We'd like to publish it. She read the email 3 times before she let herself smile. For the first time in what felt like ages, she felt seen, not as a wife or a woman abandoned, but as a voice, a storyteller. The piece was shared thousands of times. Comments poured in, women, men, strangers, thanking her for putting into words what they had felt but couldn't express. You wrote my story, one comment read. I didn't think anyone else understood. That night, Julia lit a candle, sat on the floor of her old living room and cried, not because she was broken, but because she was beginning to believe she was healing. The pain hadn't disappeared, but now it had meaning. Her suffering had been repurposed. And in that, she found power. Have you ever felt your heart begin to mend, not all at once, but slowly, stitch by stitch, with every truth you dared to speak aloud? The library became more than just Julia's workplace. It became her sanctuary. The quiet hum of pages turning, the soft scent of old paper and wood polish, the gentle hush that seemed to cradle every broken part of her. It was here, tucked between fiction shelves and poetry stacks, that she found not only healing, but something else entirely. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when he first walked in. Tall, slightly scruffy, with kind eyes, and a posture that spoke of both confidence and humility. He was looking for a book on philosophy, The Art of Stillness, by Pico Iyer. Julia led him to the shelf, brushing her fingers along the spines until she found it. Their hands touched briefly as she passed it to him. He smiled. "Thank you. I'm Ethan," he said. "I'm new in town." There was no spark, no sudden flutter of romance. Just two people in the middle of their lives, standing quietly in a library aisle with rain tapping softly against the windows. Julia smiled back, polite but distant. She had built walls since Matthew, high ones, and she had no intention of letting anyone in. But Ethan returned. Not just once, but every week. Sometimes he borrowed books. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he just wandered into the reading room, ordered a tea from the small corner cafe, and stayed for hours, reading or sketching in a worn leather notebook. He always said, "Hello" to Julia. Sometimes they chatted about books, other times about nothing at all. He never asked too much, never pushed. He simply showed up with patience and presence. It was disarming. One afternoon, Julia found herself shelving books near the reading corner where he sat. He looked up and smiled. "You always look like you're carrying the weight of 100 stories," he said gently. Julia raised an eyebrow. "Maybe I am." "Then I hope some of them are yours," he replied. "Not just the ones you carry for others." She didn't know how to respond to that. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. Not even Matthew, not when it mattered. As the weeks passed, their conversations deepened. Ethan talked about leaving a corporate job in Chicago to unlearn everything and relearn peace. Julia talked cautiously about her love of writing and the pieces she'd started to share. They both spoke of loneliness, not in a sad, needy way, but in the quiet recognition of what it meant to be unseen for too long. Still, Julia was hesitant. She had spent so long anchoring herself, learning to stand again. The idea of leaning on someone felt dangerous, but Ethan didn't try to fix her. He didn't offer advice or promises. He simply asked, "Would make today feel like a good day for you?" "What?" And sometimes that's all someone needs to begin again. Have you ever met someone who didn't rescue you, but reminded you how to rescue yourself? Life was beginning to take on a new rhythm for Julia. Quiet, steady, and surprisingly full. Mornings at the library, afternoons spent writing, evenings filled with long walks, sometimes alone, sometimes with Ethan. She wasn't in love, not yet, but she was open. And that, in itself, was a revolution. She was no longer surviving. She was starting to live. But the past, as it often does, found a way to sneak back in. It arrived in the form of an envelope, thick, elegant, cream-colored, with embossed gold lettering. Julia knew the handwriting before she even opened it. Matthew. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside was an invitation to a launch gala for his new tech firm. The event was black tie, hosted at one of the city's most luxurious hotels. Her name was printed in perfect script. "You're cordially invited." She stared at it for a long time. Why would he invite her? A peace offering? A guilt offering? Or worse, some attempt to parade his new life in front of her? For 2 days, Julia let the invitation sit untouched on her nightstand. Part of her wanted to tear it up. But another part, quieter, braver, knew she needed to go. Not for him, for herself. To face the man who had left her and to prove without words that she had moved. Ethan noticed the tension in her shoulders as they sat across from each other at their favorite coffee shop. "Bad news?" he asked. "More like a test," she said, sliding the invitation across the table. Ethan read it and then looked up with soft eyes. "Will it help you heal going there?" "I think it might," Julia replied. "He never thought I'd become." Not to confront him. Just to walk into that room as someone. Ethan nodded slowly. "Honor your own growth. Then go, but not for closure. You don't need his validation. Go to..." And so she did. The night of the gala, Julia slipped into a midnight blue dress that hugged her just right. Her hair was pinned back loosely, her makeup soft but radiant. She didn't need to sparkle like the others. She glowed from something deeper. When she stepped into the ballroom, the crystal chandeliers shimmered above her, but all eyes turned toward her. Not because she was the wealthiest, but because she carried herself like someone who knew her worth. She spotted Matthew across the room, laughing with investors, drink in hand. When his eyes met hers, something flickered behind his confident facade. Was it regret? Shock? Awe? He made his way toward her slowly, a faint smile on his lips. "You look amazing," he said. Julia met his gaze evenly. "I know." There was no revenge in her voice. No pain, just truth. And that more than anything shook him. Have you ever walked into a room where you were once invisible and left a lasting silence, without saying a single word? In the days following the gala, Julia felt lighter, liberated even. She had faced her past, without flinching. But as life often does, the universe had one more twist waiting for her. It came in the form of a message, short, familiar, from a number she hadn't blocked. Though, maybe she should have. "Matthew, you looked beautiful the other night. Can we talk?" Julia stared at the message, her breath catching. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised. She had felt it in his eyes that night. The look that men get when they realize too late what they gave up. But the woman he had known no longer existed. And the woman she had become had no desire to be anyone's what if. Still, curiosity lingered. What did he want to say? Why now? The texts continued, each one more pointed than the last. "I made mistakes. I miss us. I didn't realize how much you meant to me until you weren't there." It would have been so easy to fall into that trap, into nostalgia, into longing, into the illusion that love, even when broken, could be glued back together. But Julia wasn't looking for what they had. She had built something new, something real, something that didn't require her to shrink. Still, doubt whispered, what if he's changed? What if he's truly sorry? She brought it up to Ethan one evening, as they sat under a blanket on her porch, sipping hot tea. The air was crisp with the scent of burning wood and fallen leaves. She didn't want to keep secrets. "He's reaching out," she said quietly. "He wants to talk." Ethan didn't react the way she expected. He didn't tense or grow jealous. He simply looked at her, calm and sure. "Do you want to talk to him?" Julia hesitated. "I don't know. Part of me does. For closure, maybe clarity." Ethan nodded. "Then talk to him. But know this, whatever you need to heal, I support. Just don't confuse a wound reopening for a door being offered." His words settled in her like warm truth. The next day, Julia sat at her desk and opened a blank page. She didn't respond to Matthew. Instead, she wrote him a letter she never planned to send. In it, she poured everything she had carried. The love, the pain, the betrayal, and the lessons. She ended it simply. "Thank you for leaving me. In your absence, I found myself." She folded the letter and tucked it into her journal. A silent closure. Her own version of goodbye. That night, she slept without dreams. Have you ever realized the peace that comes not from answers, but from finally letting go of the questions? Spring came quietly, as it often does. Buds slowly blooming on tree branches, the air warming just enough to soften jackets and lift moods. For Julia, it marked not just a shift in seasons, but a transformation in her spirit. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer held the wheel. In its place was something she hadn't felt in years, peace. Her writing had taken off in ways she never expected. More blogs reached out. One of her essays was published in a national lifestyle magazine under her own name, Julia Bennett. Seeing her name in print, untouched by Matthew's shadow, felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. Readers resonated with her words. Emails flooded in. "You gave me courage. I left after 10 years of being invisible. Thank you for telling our story." The power of vulnerability had become her strength. At the same time, her bond with Ethan grew deeper, not in the whirlwind, fairy tale way her past relationship had, but with a steady hum of mutual respect and quiet joy. They didn't talk about the future in lofty ideals or rushed promises. They lived it in the small, sacred ways, shared grocery runs, Sunday pancakes, finishing each other's sentences mid-story. He made her laugh, even on the hard days. She challenged him to slow down, to sit still, to breathe. One afternoon, they spent hours planting wildflowers in the garden behind her house. dirt. Under their nails, sweat on their brows, and smiles that came easily. As they worked, Ethan looked over and said, "You know, I used to think healing meant forgetting. Now I think it just means growing something beautiful from where you were broken." Julia paused, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Then this garden is going to be wild." She laughed. They didn't need grand gestures. There was no elaborate proposal. Just a moment one early morning, sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun rise. Ethan turned to her, holding her hand, and said, "Whatever this is, however long it lasts, I want to keep choosing it. Choosing you." And Julia, whose love had once been taken for granted, finally felt what it was to be loved. Not for who she could become, but for who she already was. That night, she journaled before bed. "This isn't a new chapter," she wrote. "It's a new book, and I finally like the author. Have you ever reached a place in life where you realize you're not waiting to be rescued anymore because you became your own hero?" It had been nearly a year since Julia had seen Matthew face to face. Aside from the brief, stilted interaction at his gala, time had done its work. The sharp sting of betrayal had dulled, leaving behind scar tissue and wisdom. Julia no longer checked his social media. She didn't wonder what he was doing. Her life had grown full of words, of warmth, of mornings with Ethan and evenings filled with purpose. But life, in its quiet irony, brought Matthew back into her orbit in the most unexpected way. It was a local charity event, an annual fundraiser for women's shelters, something Julia had become passionate about since sharing her own story. She had been invited to speak about healing and the importance of community. She wore a soft blush dress that flowed like peace itself and walked onto the small stage with confidence that only truth could build. After her talk, as people mingled with glasses of sparkling cider and soft jazz played in the D background, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned, and there he was. Matthew looked different. His suit was sharp, yes, but the gleam in his eye was dimmer, the lines on his face deeper. He had lost weight, and the ever-present phone in his hand now sat tucked away like even he was tired of its demands. There was no arrogance in his expression, just something quieter, something almost vulnerable. "Julia," he said, offering a half-smile. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I was invited," she replied evenly. "I gave a talk." "I heard," he nodded. "You were incredible." She didn't respond with false humility. She had learned not to shrink herself. He cleared his throat. "I just wanted to say, I've been following your work, reading your essays. I know I don't deserve to say this, but I'm proud of you, truly." Julia studied him for a moment. This wasn't the man who had walked out on her. This was someone softer, quieter, maybe even broken in his own way. But the part of her that once would have ached to hear those words, it wasn't there anymore. "I hope you're finding what you were looking for," she said gently. He looked down, then back at her. "To be honest, I don't know what that is anymore, but watching you, reading your words, it's made me think." They stood in silence for a beat. Two people who had once shared everything and now shared nothing but a history. There was no animosity, no anger, just closure. "I wish you well, Matthew," she said sincerely, and she meant it. He nodded slowly, and as he walked away, Julia felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Not the triumph of someone who had won, but the serenity of someone who had moved beyond needing to. Have you ever looked into the eyes of the person who broke you and realized they no longer have the power to shake your soul? The days that followed the charity event felt different, lighter, like a page had been turned, and the ink had dried on a chapter long overdue for closure. Julia walked through her world with more ease, no longer glancing over her shoulder for shadows of the past. Her energy had shifted, not because she had forgotten, but because she had forgiven, not for Matthew's sake, but for her own. Her writing had blossomed into a full-blown career. What began as anonymous submissions had grown into a thriving blog and a weekly podcast called Stronger After. Her voice reached tens of thousands. Her inbox overflowed with letters from strangers who weren't strangers at all. Women who had been left, overlooked, forgotten, Men who had been broken, rebuilt, and were now trying to love better. Teenagers who had heard her words and found the courage to believe in their own. One message came from a woman in Iowa. It read, "I listened to your story in the middle of the night while sitting in my car, unsure if I could go back inside to the life I was trapped in. You helped me choose myself. I don't know you, but I love you for that." Julia read it 3 times, tears quietly streaming down her cheeks. She printed it and pinned it to her vision board, right next to a sticky note she had written months earlier that simply said, "Keep going. Someone needs your voice." Her days were filled with meaning now, not the kind that came with grand accolades or flashing lights, but the quiet, fulfilling kind. Morning sun spilling onto her writing desk, readers who messaged her saying her words gave them courage, and the laughter of Ethan, echoing through the house they now shared. They lived in a modest cottage tucked just outside the city, surrounded by trees and the sound of birdsong at dawn. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't dripping in marble and chandeliers. But it was filled with the scent of fresh coffee, mismatched dishes, books piled in every corner, and love, authentic, calm, enduring love. Ethan often said, "Our house may be small, but every room has purpose." They made traditions: Friday night dinners on the porch, Sunday hikes, monthly silent days, where they put away phones and simply existed together in quiet harmony. On their anniversary, not of dating or marriage, but of the first day they met, they planted a new tree in the yard. "One day this will shade someone else who needs to rest," Julia had said, patting the soil. She no longer wondered what Matthew was doing. She no longer compared her life to the glittering, curated version she used to dream of, because now she had something real, not perfection but presence, not wealth but wisdom, not a life she was given, but one she had built. Have you ever found yourself standing in the very life you once thought you'd lost and realized it was better than anything you could have imagined? Time passed, as it always does. Seasons turned, leaves changed, and life continued to unfold, not in dramatic twists or loud declarations, but in quiet, meaningful moments. Julia's life no longer felt like a wound she had to nurse. It felt like a garden she had nurtured into bloom. She no longer needed validation, success, or even recognition. She wrote because it fulfilled her. She loved because it made her whole. She spoke at conferences, mentored young women, and became a quiet force of compassion in her community. People saw her as an inspiration, a beacon of resilience, but she never let it go to her head. She knew what it had cost her to get here. And Matthew? He faded from the spotlight slowly, the way fireworks do, loud, bright, then gone. The startup faltered. The media buzz quieted. The woman he had left Julia for moved on long ago. They had built something quick and flashy, but it never had roots. Without depth, even the most beautiful things collapse. Word eventually reached Julia that he had moved into a small apartment and taken a job with a smaller firm. He wasn't struggling, but he wasn't thriving either. He had success, once, but not significance. And maybe that's what he had been chasing all along. Julia didn't feel smug when she heard this. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt nothing, not indifference, but peace. She had made her peace with that chapter, and there was no need to revisit it. One warm spring evening, Julia sat on the back porch with Ethan, their hands loosely intertwined, watching the sky melt into pink and lavender. Fireflies blinked lazily across the yard. Their dog slept at their feet, and the distant hum of life surrounded them like a lullaby. Ethan leaned in and whispered, "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" Julia smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the stars. "Like where I am now. Sometimes. But I try not to live in the past. And she meant it. Because for all the heartbreak and all the lessons learned, Julia had finally reached a place where her life was hers, fully, authentically, completely. Not built from the remnants of someone else's dream, but crafted from her own strength, her own voice, her own heart. She didn't get the happy ending she once imagined. She got something better, a true beginning. And maybe, just maybe, that's what we're all really searching for, not the story we thought we wanted, but the one we were always meant to write. Have you ever discovered that your greatest heartbreak was actually your greatest turning point? And that, dear viewers, is the story of Julia, a woman who was abandoned, broken, but never defeated. A woman who turned pain into power and betrayal into beauty. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that healing is possible and joy can be rebuilt, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs hope, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, heal, and uplift. Because sometimes the end is just the beginning. Thanks for watching. And until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and keep rising.